thank you both so much for joining me today. There's been several devastating personal data breaches involving UK police forces in recent weeks, which we were just talking about, with potentially life-changing consequences for those affected. Now, you two played a key role in exposing the fact that the Meta Pixel tracking tool passed on sensitive personal information taken from people's browsing history for targeted advertising purposes. Could you talk me through what happened and how you became involved?
I think it's wider than the Meta tracking tool. It's social media sites. And what this come about? This has come about from a series of actions. If you go back to 2021, the FT actually raised this, Financial Times. They talked about the fact that sensitive data was being passed across to third parties through the use of tags or code that's put onto websites for one purpose, but is then utilised by third parties as part of their terms and conditions. And this has gained traction in the US because they've started looking at things such as HIPAA, their health-related data processing, and they're applying laws which came about from 2009. So it's gaining a lot of traction in the US, as well as there's been some reports of this in the Swedish press. There's a Swedish radio program called Echo, which highlighted this in 2022. And it has referred this to the Swedish Data Protection Authority, or in some cases gone to that. And I was looking through for some cases to explain this to charities, because a lot of charities do this inadvertently. And I picked this up on the police website. I've got a daughter who I showed it to, and she said, that's wrong. You need to do something about it. And Rowenna and myself know each other, and I really value Rowenna's opinion. And part of me was concerned that by publicising this, there would be a backlash, or people, if this got out and people who need care and help, because these are sensitive sites, people who have suffered an alleged sexual assault go to these sites. I was concerned that these people would not feel comfortable going there and therefore wouldn't get the care they required. So I spoke with Rowenna. I spoke with a couple of other colleagues who are in the data protection community and said, firstly, have I got this right? And secondly, what's the sensible way to do this in an ethical basis? How do we approach this? I'd spoken to the DPO at Nottinghamshire Police. It's a national police issue. It's not just Nottinghamshire. And after hadn't got any, what I felt was progress, I asked Rowenna, and Rowenna, I'll let you come in. I've spoken for long enough on that bit.
Yeah, Stef got in touch with me. We've had a lot of conversations about data protection and particularly e-privacy and data ethics. And he said, have a look at this and tell me what you think. So I went on to the Nottinghamshire Police webpage that he'd linked to me, and it was a page for reporting intimate partner violence, sexual assault, that sort of thing. And a cookie banner popped up that had two choices, and it said the usual, like, oh, we use cookies to enhance your experience, which I don't think is anywhere near adequate an explanation of what ad tech tracking and profiling and targeting really does. And the two options were okay and settings. So strike one. They didn't have a clear explanation of what the tracking actually was, what functions it performed, where the data went. And secondly, there wasn't an easy way to declare upfront, don't track me. So I looked closer, and we discovered that if you went to the settings page, the trackers would all be off by default, which is great. So that's for cookies specifically, and that's important. But if you clicked OK, everything would be instantly turned on, with no differentiation up front between performance analytics, retargeting, etc., etc. So while it wasn't the worst cookie implementation I'd ever seen, it wasn't great. And obviously the third parties to which data was going were a matter of serious concern, because the usual suspects were there: Meta, Google, I believe DoubleClick might have been in there as well. I can't remember off the top of my head. And one might say, what's the harm? But actually, because of the way programmatic advertising works with keywords and associations and inferences, it's completely realistic to expect that as a result of that, people might start seeing ads for, at the most benign end, crisis support, but actually other ads for things like targeted anti-pregnancy termination messages. We know that is being paid for and targeted by certain groups. Stuff relating to an immensely traumatic experience that is absolutely nobody else's business, suddenly being used to get those people to essentially open their wallets and do clicks.
And if they're perhaps sharing a computer with someone who's perpetrating the violence against them, then they're going to have an idea, why is this coming up? Why am I seeing this? And that's potentially putting their lives in danger.
Exactly. So my original background was in information security, not for a long time now, but I remembered having a lot of conversations about responsible disclosure, things like vulnerabilities and whatnot. And it was a bit of an ethical dilemma, because on the one hand, one doesn't want to put people off from reporting. I mean, under-reporting is already a massive problem. But on the other hand, I felt very strongly that it wasn't right to leave people in the dark and let them continue being exposed to significant risks without knowing. They should be able to make an informed choice. So Stef said he'd spoken to the police service in question, and we'd looked at the architecture, and it was evidently a blanket configuration that had been applied to the whole web estate without anyone having gone through and thought, is there any place where this shouldn't be happening? So we decided that really, going to regulatory authorities and then the media was the only course of action left to us. So yeah, that's what happened.
How frustrating was it to sort of, once these concerns, this serious flaw had been identified, to have such an underwhelming response from the police themselves?
We work in data protection, we're used to it.
Yeah. On that one, and there are different levels of believability. And you're talking about in this, but people are going to these sites and they've been through a traumatic experience, and they're not there for fun. They're there to access a service that they feel they require. And one of the major issues with sexual crimes is believability, evidence, etc. I think the thing that I found most frustrating was that when this was identified and Rowenna had a look at it, other people within the data protection community had a look at it, and everyone was saying, yes, this is happening. The fact that we'd got so many people in the community had identified that this was happening, we then sent it forward, and it seemed to go into this, the longest of long grass. And I think my frustration was, I felt this was important. It didn't get the level of importance that I felt it deserved. And that's why I think we got that frustration.
And what was it? So once you decided to go to the sort of regulatory bodies and to the media, I mean, how did the issue snowball from there?
I think there's two avenues, but there's actually three avenues here. Firstly, I anticipated once we went to the regulatory authority that this would be something that would immediately be a cease and desist order. I haven't had confirmation one way or the other of whether that's happened. The second is we went to the media, and the story that ran was predominantly regarding Meta and the Met. Maybe because they are two, areas of the media chose to focus on, and that gave the story. I'm not a journalist, so I don't fully understand that. The third is that we went to local MPs and to the police and crime commissioners. And there's another person who's involved in this. I won't give his details, but he's also been involved in communicating with his MP. And the thing that we haven't had yet, and this is frustrating, from the off, I've said that the people involved in this, myself and other people, if somebody wants to speak to us, we will explain our concerns and made my details available. We haven't had anybody come to us. And that is where I think we've lost this degree of self-policing. Ideally, I hoped that the regulator would have solved this. I would have hoped that the person in charge of the websites would have solved this. But I do feel that sometimes we get into this, if something is an issue, it's better to get, sunlight is the best disinfectant. But often this gets shoveled away somewhere, or you have an area of, I know one of the responses we've got back through my MP is that no personal data is involved in this. We've had to go back and say, well, have a look at this case, that case, look at we provide a whole list of reference information. And that's what I find is frustrating, is that we still haven't got confirmation of this has been switched off fully. There are one or two things still on the website which we're slightly concerned with.
Yeah, so despite essentially going for the sort of nuclear option, you've tried every avenue. It seems that this is still a concern, and people are potentially still risking their this, hugely sensitive information being shared with third parties. And you said that, so I mean, ultimately, it's not been resolved. That's where we're at the moment.
Yes, and I think, again, the piece here that I was keen to do is to use this as a learning experience. I once saw somebody, or I've got a relative of mine who's involved in the armed forces. He spoke about the SAS, and the SAS have a phrase which is, you've got to learn from your mistakes, but it's cheaper and often easier to learn from other people's. And, this, I don't think this is a conspiracy. Apologies, I know we're recording this. This is a cock-up. Somebody has not done their job. An outcome has come about, and the outcome is detrimental. Therefore, stop the problem, solve the problem, and then learn from the problem. Experiential learning.
I think it's, well, I agree with absolutely everything you said there. I think it would be dangerous to oversimplify and say somebody has not done their job. I think the problem goes deeper than that. I think the problem is that it doesn't seem to be anybody's job. The organizations have policies which say it's everybody's responsibility to do data protection, but then executive management don't get hands-on with strategy and risk appetite. Middle management don't get hands-on with monitoring policy adherence and feedback loops where the policy is working, and frontline people get a long, boring document to read on day one of their employment, and then basically chucked in at the deep end. And what usually happens to the poor DPO is that they're doing the work of 12 people on the salary of half a person, and they are battling with enormous knowledge gaps. So in order to try and get, and this is what we found when we were trying to talk to people about this issue, they simply did not comprehend the first details of what we were talking about. For example, like no personal data has been exposed. Well, that's not true. But you need to understand the definition of personal data to know that's not true. And that's absolute basic knowledge that by law, organizations need to make sure their employees have comprehension of and competency in. So it's very hard to point to any one single person and say, this is your fault, because it isn't any one single person's fault. This is a systemic issue that speaks both to organizational priorities, in which human beings' safety in digital is still a very new concept, but also the fact that ad tech has permeated everything, and it's so normalized that people it's harder not to use it than it is to use it, and B, people use it without thinking it through because everybody else does. And those are immensely difficult problems to address, which is why I think we're probably in for a long haul here.
I would agree with Rowenna. It's not an individual person's job. I always, when I see that there are awards coming up for data protection, I always submit to Shirley Someone, because Shirley Someone is the person in every organisation who is responsible for this, and that's where I think this is falling down. There is, as Rowenna rightly points out, it's a institutional, and I think we've all got limited resources. Part of this has come about because the police are having to operate on limited resources, that they've introduced a new system. But it's about, I've got to choose my words, it's about caring. You've got to care that there is an individual here. There's an individual here, and the people forgive and forget. The internet does neither. And so by people going onto this site, this data is being collected. You can use different phrases, and people are better, more literate than I am. You could call it captured. You could call it harvested. Data points are being collected regarding an individual, and that data is now going to reside somewhere. If you're not aware that you're collecting the data, you're not aware that you need to delete the data. You've got no retention policy for it. You've got no understanding of where it's going to impact. And that impact might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, but when you get into machine learning of data points, that data point is like potentially to be utilized in an algorithm that somebody doesn't understand to impact somebody going forward. You've lost, that person has lost agency of data they didn't even realize was being collected.
So really what you're both saying is that this issue goes right to the heart of culture and governance, and it's a society-wide issue and problem.
It absolutely is about culture and governance. And this is a real challenge with especially digital technology, because it's easier to use recklessly, much easier to use recklessly and thoughtlessly and carelessly than it is to use responsibly. And trying to shoehorn those responsibilities, the knowledge, the understanding, the process interrupts, the decision making into organizations that are already, stretched to breaking point because everybody's running around trying to do more and more and more all the time, it's an enormous challenge. And particularly when it comes to tracking and targeting technologies, these were designed and developed and are mostly used specifically for the purpose of leveraging technology in pursuit of psychological advantage. That's what digital marketing is. It's what it's all about. It's what it's for. And it's great, very clever, very useful. But there are some places where that is absolutely not appropriate. The power imbalance, the context, people's sensibilities, people's safety. And there's a real tendency in organizations to assume that because they're all nice people doing nice things, therefore everything they do is good and nice. They don't understand that they're actually playing with the most dangerous stuff humanity has ever invented, and that they have to make an effort to direct their actions towards consciously being careful and safe and responsible and respectful. Because if they don't make that conscious action, the outcomes won't be those things. And that's not really sunk in yet.
And so what do you both think? What do you think that we need to do to stop this from happening again and keep on, because it's still happening? And what can we learn from this?
Well, I think some enforcement action would be handy. I mean, I know the ICO has a policy of not leveraging monetary penalties against public authorities, but an enforcement notice or two, at least, you know, if nothing else, to say, go back and redo the DPIA, because this is monitoring technology. There should be a DPIA, or, you know, take down tracking, ad tech tracking from pages where people report crimes, you know, really basic stuff like that, that forces organizations to action, constructive, useful action. Because at the moment there is no disincentive toward in this behavior. Organizations look around, they see everybody else is doing it, everybody else is benefiting from it. They think, well, you know, it's not technically legal, but the risk is low. They don't think about the impact to the individual, and that's self-reinforcing behavior. So I think something needs to break that loop with, you know, a degree of force, not violence, but, you know, firmness. And there does need to be, you know, massive public education. There already is, but it needs to be better than the dry kind of corporate e-learning stuff like this, for example, Project Bijou. Yay.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's what we hope. We feel really strongly as well that there has to be a way to make people understand at a sort of visceral level how serious all this is.
I think also that there's an element here of awareness and education, but I also think there's a requirement for the regulators potentially to look at the technology providers and be more forceful in ensuring that the information that's provided to people to review the technology is aligned with data protection principles. I'm sadly, I've read through most of the technology providers in this space, their documentation, and if you look long and hard enough, this is fairly clear. It's fairly clear that by putting these tools onto your system and configuring them in certain ways, you will collect this data and you will share it with them for their personal, for their use. So it is fairly clear, but it's very taxing to go through various documentation. It's separated in a variety of places. Most people should do a data protection impact assessment into this, and everyone starts a data protection impact assessment with that. You should be looking at things such as the data process flows. Those sort of things are looking through them and understanding the risks associated with it. But there isn't a standard data protection flow provided by the service providers. In some respects, I would like somebody like the ICO to almost form a collaboration for some of these are common technologies. You know, this is not one organization serving one organization. The majority of websites will have considered using Google Analytics and Google Ads. They would have considered Facebook Pixel. They'll be looking at TikTok. They'll be looking at these organizations saying, well, actually, we can get enhanced reporting in this service, but they often don't think, what are we exchanging for this additional information and this additional value?
And it's not a straight exchange either, because I mean, they might be paying for these services, but actually the adverse impacts aren't felt by either the organisation putting these technologies in or the technology providers. They are wholly externalised. They're individual and social impacts that are borne by individuals and societies. And it's funny what Stef was saying. He's absolutely right. If you want to understand the privacy implications of ad tech technology, don't look at their privacy information. It's worthless. Look at their marketing and sales and their claims of what they can do and their integration guides and their developer material, because that's where the truth is. It's not in their privacy PR stuff, and that really needs to change as well. You know, there's a tendency to assume that as long as you have a document with privacy notice or DPIA written on it, the job's done. But notably absent from either are serious consideration of impacts to individuals' fundamental rights and freedoms. That's what it's all about, and that's the bit that's MIA all over the place.
I also think that if you have a look at the way that this technology is deployed, is that you'll have a website owner will usually ask a website designer or an agency to design a website, and they will then put on technology that they might utilize elsewhere. So for example, this technology, if used responsibly and transparently, might suit for, say, a fashion retail brand. If you're then working on a fashion retail brand and then moving on to a service for enabling people to report potential sexual offences, don't use the same technology. You've got, there's this awareness piece that needs to happen. People say in data protection that the most common word is it depends. I would like to get that. A second common phrase should be, I don't know, but I'll go and find out.
Yes, that would be progress indeed, wouldn't it?